The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Tonight, John Michael McGrath and yours truly bring you the latest developments from Ontario's 44th general election. Then, journalist Catherine Salikas joins us to discuss her new book on Liberal leadership candidate Chrystia Freeland. That's next on The Agenda. Welcome, everyone, to the onpoli podcast. I'm Steve Paikin.
And I'm John Michael McGrath.
Today on the pod, the Trump tariffs may be on pause, but they've taken over the narrative of this Ontario election campaign.
The Liberals are determined to keep the focus on Doug Ford's healthcare record.
Meantime, the election isn't even a week old yet, and the Conservatives already have endorsements from 4 labor unions.
And our quote of note this week focuses on, what else? Trump and tariffs.
It's Tuesday, February 4th, 2025, so let's get to it. JMM?
Hello, sir.
Here we are, our first Tuesday, right?
Yes, first Tuesday.
We have to remind people, in case they haven't heard, that during this 44th general election campaign, JMM and I are not only doing the thing Friday night, as we always did, but we are adding a second podcast to the onpoli schedule. So every Tuesday, right up until February 27th, Election Day, we're going to be here as well, because you just can't get enough of us, right?
Yeah, so we'll be doing election night, and then I imagine we'll do a Friday podcast thereafter as well.
Right, day after the election.
We're going to be busy.
Absolutely. Now, and this date, incidentally, February 4th, today, is also an interesting anniversary of sorts. It was 15 years ago today that voters in Toronto Centre voted in a by-election to replace Liberal Cabinet Minister George Smitherman, who had left Queen's Park to... Do you remember? I think my T-shirt kind of gives it away.
Yes, I do recall that he ran for mayor of Toronto. I covered that race.
He did indeed. Oh, you covered that race, in which case the next few questions are going to be fairly simple. But do you remember who he ran against?
I do. He ran against, let's see, there was Joe Pantalone, there was Rocco Rossi, and Rob Ford.
Yeah,
yes.
That was the guy I was thinking of, whose brother is?
The current Premier, Doug Ford.
Everything connects.
Yes.
You see that? Back in 2010, Doug Ford's brother Rob won that election with nearly half the votes. And the polls today show that Doug Ford and his PCs are leading the pack with, you guessed it, nearly half the votes. Incidentally, do you remember who won the by-election to replace George Smitherman in Toronto Centre? I can give you a hint if you need one.
I actually don't, because he was kind of a big deal in Kathleen Wynne's cabinet when I went to Queen's Park in 2013. That would be Glenn Murray.
You are correct. He thought about running for the Liberal leadership, but then dropped out, backed her, was the mayor of Winnipeg, ran to be leader of the Greens.
Yes.
Didn't win that one.
Yes.
But he had a good time at Queen's Park. He had a meaningful career at Queen's Park.
He was Minister of Infrastructure and Minister of Transportation, if I recall correctly, and then became Minister of Environment later on, and stick-handled the early implementation of the cap-and-trade system.
Absolutely right. There we go. So that's the explanation behind the T-shirt for today. I'm going to continue to pull out some of the old T-shirts from back in the day. I think I had one for Jack Layton. This one's for George Smitherman. So next one's going to be for a Tory. You watch.
I have no explicitly political T-shirts that I can think of. No campaign swag that I know of.
That is obvious, given your choice of wardrobe on this podcast.
Yes,
I can tell.
Yes, no, I tend more towards dinosaurs and aliens.
And with I could do a line with that, but I'll hold it. Off to issue 1. Ontario's 44th general election was barely a few days old when Donald Trump and his tariffs moved center stage in the campaign narrative. Suddenly, issues that normally would have taken up a lot of bandwidth in a provincial election campaign, well, they moved to the sidelines. However, yesterday afternoon, the country caught a bit of a break. After a conversation with Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, Trump agreed to delay the tariffs for 30 days, but this was an angry Doug Ford yesterday morning.
But I'm not going to support someone that is hell-bent on destroying our province, destroying people's families, taking jobs away from them. We're done with that. We never started this fight whatsoever, but we're going to win this fight.
Doug Ford yesterday. JMM, what else can you tell us about how Ontario is reacting to all this?
Well, of course, we have a list of measures that the province was prepared to take that are currently on pause. The LCBO, we already discussed last week, was preparing to take American products off of the shelves as certainly one of the world's largest buyers of alcohol. That could have taken a bite out of U.S. sales. Ford had also announced that the government was going to prohibit American firms from bidding on Ontario government contracts. So that was like procurement and infrastructure contracts. Potentially, the government is talking about spending $200 billion over the next decade on infrastructure. So cutting American firms out of that amount of work would have been significant. Then he had also announced that the province was going to tear up the $100 million contract with Starlink. This is Elon Musk's satellite-based internet service provider that Ontario has signed a contract with to serve remote and rural communities that are looking for better internet connection. All of those moves are now paused. If tariffs come back again, those moves can also come back again. We are sort of in a weird in-between state right now.
Yeah, Doug Ford, in fact, saying Ontario's not going to do business with people who are hell-bent on destroying our economy, which was, again, ratcheting up the rhetoric a little bit. What's interesting about the Starlink deal is that the Liberal leader, Bonnie Crombie, has been calling for Ford to rip up that deal for about a week now. And initially, Ford said, well, hang on a sec, Elon Musk offered a good service. He offered the best price, so I don't see any reason to cancel the deal here. But clearly, the way things have changed, it just goes to show you, a week is a lifetime in politics, right? And a week later, the Tories pretty clearly changed their minds about this and announced they would end the deal. But that threat is off right now. It's $100 million, but it wasn't set to kick in until June. So no money has been paid yet. And again, we will watch events, dear boy, events unfold to see what will transpire and when.
Yeah, the company that lost the competition to Starlink, I found this interesting yesterday, a Canadian ISP called Explore. On Monday morning, their website featured this big banner that said, built by Canadians for Canadians, which maybe it was a coincidence, but I think it certainly captures the mood that we saw certainly on Monday with a lot of people very angry about the tariff threats and I'm certainly seeing way more discussion right now of, how does one buy Canadian goods and services and how does one leave American goods on the shelf. About Starlink, I don't think it is controversial to say that Starlink is the biggest satellite internet service provider, arguably the best, but there are others in the market. Explore being just one example of a firm that is trying to compete in this space. There are more getting into this line of business. So if Ontario has to revisit this decision in a month's time or in 6 months' time, Trump is going to be president for 4 years. There are going to be options to explore. In the meantime, remote and rural communities are still waiting for that improved internet service.
Indeed they are. And with that, we're off to issue 2. Tariffs notwithstanding, the Ontario Liberals are determined to keep Doug Ford's healthcare record in as much of the spotlight as they can. The Liberals have even rented a campaign-style bus with elements of Ford's record on the exterior of that bus. Now, we've actually got some pictures of it here, and for those who are listening on podcast, we'll describe what we're seeing. There's a shot of a red bus, campaign style, but not with Liberal leader Bonnie Crombie's picture on the side, which is normally what you would see during an election campaign. Instead, it says 11,000 people died waiting for surgery last year. This is Doug Ford's Ontario. And then if you go, I don't know if we've got another picture here, but there's, on the other side of the bus, it says 2.5 million people have no family doctor. This is Doug Ford's Ontario. This is unique. I'm not sure I've ever seen this before.
Yeah, I don't know that there is an Ontario precedent. You mentioned it doesn't have Bonnie Crombie's face on it. There is a bit of lettering at the bottom that says, vote Bonnie Crombie to change this, but it doesn't mention the Liberal Party by name as far as I can see. Crombie has really has already done a number of healthcare-focused announcements. The Liberals were attacking the government relentlessly on their healthcare record long before the election was called, so this is not like a surprise. She was in Kitchener-Waterloo this week and announced as part of her idea for a way of tariff-proofing the Ontario economy that a Liberal government would offer a bonus to Canadian-born nurses, Canadian qualified nurses and doctors who want to return from the U.S. and practice in Ontario. It is interesting, I think, at least as of yesterday, that, with so much focus on tariffs and the threat of tariffs, and obviously, like, the Premier wants to talk about his role as being, the only person who can protect Ontario from the threat of tariffs. The Liberals are not entirely, but pretty consistently sticking to healthcare as a message. They really think that this is a winning message for them.
Well, I think they've pretty clearly come to the conclusion that Doug Ford owns the tariff issues, that if you're going to get into a fight with the Premier on the issue of protecting Ontario, he's got the bigger megaphone for that. So they have determined that they're going to go over something else, and they're moving over to healthcare. Interesting, like the NDP made a different decision. They have focused a lot on tariffs in the first week, saying that they will protect workers to the nth degree, will protect you better than Doug Ford can. I'm not sure how successful they'll be at competing with Ford on that stage. So the Liberals are staying on healthcare. We'll see what else the NDP's got up its sleeve. Meantime, back to the Liberals. What else they got going?
Well, I do want to stick on this issue of, a lack of family doctors. This has been a core part of the Liberal message. They, had broken out riding by riding which areas of the province were most in need of family doctors, so that they could, attack each individual Conservative candidate and say, in your riding, while you were in government, X number of people lacked a family doctor, right? So there's been this consistent thread in their attacks on the government. And just to add on to a bit of what you were saying, I think part of the gamble here, and it is a gamble, is that, this is a 4-week campaign, and admittedly, we've spent the first few days talking about tariffs, Trump and tariffs. But are we still going to be talking about that 4 weeks from now? Maybe not. And, maybe after, particularly now that the threat seems to have receded until after voting day, maybe some of this stuff will just recede into the background and it will become a bit more of a conventional election campaign. Ontario election campaigns tend conventionally to be about things like healthcare and education.
Right on.
So this might be a good play for them. I said earlier, I don't know of an Ontario precedent. We couldn't let this segment pass without saying that there is a precedent from another jurisdiction. Some of our viewers and listeners may remember the precedent from not so long ago in the Brexit referendum.
You're talking about the wording on a bus.
Yes.
That precedent.
Yes. So Boris Johnson traveled the UK in a bus campaigning for the Leave side in the Brexit referendum with the message, we send the EU £350 million a week. Let's fund our NHS instead, the NHS being the United Kingdom's National Health Service, their public health provider. This claim, I will say, was hotly contested.
Hotly contested? I think that's a nice way of saying that claim was utter and complete El Toro poo-poo. Yeah.
Yes, hogwash, malarkey,
yes.
Whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
And Brexit has not resulted in a windfall for the NHS or anything else. But the Leave campaign did win that referendum, and Boris Johnson would in fact become Prime Minister not that long after. So you can't say that the tactic was ineffective.
It was very effective. It just wasn't accurate. What was the thing you said a few weeks ago that I loved so much?
Was that an assertion without evidence or an assertion lacking evidence?
There we go. Yeah, which is a nice way of saying it was a lie. The Liberal attacks do not end there. They just dropped an ad, I guess it was earlier this week. Premier Ford was caught kind of behind the scenes preparing to do an event with the firefighters, and he was caught on a live microphone saying some things about President Donald Trump. And it didn't take long for the Liberals to take that snippet and turn it into an attack ad. Let's have a little look at a bit of what that ad had to say. Roll it if you would.
Doug Ford just said he was happy Donald Trump won the election.
The election day, was I happy this guy won? 100% I was.
Happy the guy who campaigned on a trade war with Canada became president?
The tariff will be substantial in some cases.
I am a tariff man standing on a tariff platform.
Was I happy this guy won? 100% I was.
He was happy?
Okay, let's do a little context here, because the ad goes on for another, 35, 40 seconds to basically repeat that same clip. I was 100% happy when Trump won. That will not come as any surprise to anybody who has followed Doug Ford's career. He has said in the past he's been an admirer of Trump's. He has said in the past, I'm a big fan of the Republican Party. He is he came into office in 2018 being a disruptive populist. Yes. So none of that is a surprise. The timing of saying it right now, okay? But what the Liberal ad doesn't do is allow the cameras to continue the rest of what Doug Ford had to say, yes. Which was, yeah, I supported him 100%. I was glad that he won. But now that guy has stuck a shiv in us, yes. And I'm not with him anymore. Now I'm off the platform with him right now. So a very clever ad, yeah. Well put together, but taken a little out of context.
Yeah, I will say, on the other hand, that it's a fair hit to say that Ford should not have been surprised by what has happened certainly since Trump was elected. I mean, as the ad alludes to, Trump was not mysterious about his intentions yes. to hit every country on earth with tariffs, including Canada. He was saying it for months before the election. So, you know, insofar as there's a fair criticism here, I think it's that the Premier, we can be skeptical of the Premier's buyer's remorse. Let me put it that way.
Yeah, I guess we're entitled to do that. But, you know, these ads are we're going to see a lot of ads before yes. This campaign is over. The Conservatives have got way more money than anybody else. They have been extremely selective in the way that they have tried to frame Bonnie Crombie, the Liberal leader, in the past with those ads, yep. The tagline of which I'm not going to repeat because it just reinforces something that is not true.
Yes.
So this is the nature of the game. You
yeah.
try to frame your opponent before they get a chance to define themselves.
And one other thing I will add, and this is sort of like not even about the content of the ad itself, but this was a pretty quick turnaround yeah. for the Liberals, right? The hot mic moment happened yesterday. It started to blow up on social media in the afternoon. And by this, Tuesday morning, the Liberal Party had an attack ad, at least out on social media. I don't imagine they're like buying TV time with it yet. But one of the things I look for in a campaign is this kind of competence, for lack of a better word, mm-hmm. proficiency, right? Can you take a moment that happens live on the campaigning trail, something unexpected, and can you react quickly? And this, not a bad indication of the Liberals being able to react quickly.
Right on. And with that, we're off to issue 3. The last time Ontario had a winter election was 44 years ago. Bill Davis was the premier. He did make a trip to Windsor, but mostly because he sort of had to. But he did not stick around. His plane landed, he got out, did a press conference, then got back in the plane and left. Windsor was just not Tory territory. Fast forward 44 years, and my oh my have things changed. Doug Ford, another PC leader, kicked off his campaign in Windsor on day one, because the Tories have former seats they are defending in the Rose City. JMM, what does that say about Ford's relationship with Ontario's mostly private sector unions?
Right. So the PC party is very happy to get the endorsements from Unifor, LiUNA being a major construction union, the IBEW, and the firefighters.
Firefighters, a public sector union, actually.
Yes, and I'm going to get back to that in 1 second. I mean, one of the big stories in the last election was the amount of labor support that the Progressive Conservatives got and the 8 seats that they took away from the New Democrats. And I mean, seats not just in the Southwest, but in the North, places like Timmins, where they beat Gilles Bisson. Thank you. One of the biggest shifts we've seen in Ontario politics was, the lessened hostility to the labor movement from the Conservative Party. And in response, a lot of labor unions have decided, actually, so long as they're not trying to hurt us, we're willing to throw in with them.
I think at this point we should mention a guy by the name of Monty McNaughton, yes. who is no longer in public life. But he was the guy that Doug Ford gave the job, the mission, in fact, to see what he could do about improving the Progressive Conservative Party's relationship with organized labor, which, of course, has been pretty bad for a very long time. We can remember when Tim Hudak was the leader of the Ontario PC Party, he actually didn't do it, but mused about making Ontario a so-called right-to-work province, where it would be much more difficult to unionize and so on. There was a very nasty relationship between the two. Monty McNaughton was the labor minister who came in and said to Doug Ford, I think I can pry some of these private sector unions away from the Liberals and NDP. Premier Ford said, go ahead, give it a shot. They did very well at it. You pointed out 8 seats going from the NDP to the Conservatives in the last election, which is a bit of an ideological journey. But the Tories had figured out how to make that happen, and now here we are again. There is quite a split in the union movement.
Yes.
The private sector unions really seem to have peeled away a lot of their support from the NDP. Many of them are backing Ford. The public sector unions, with the exception of the firefighters, are still very anti-Ford and still backing, I guess, a mix of the Liberals and NDP. But it is really you really need a score. What do they say? You need a program to know, I'm blowing this line. You need a scorecard to see I forget it. You know the line I'm trying to come up with, but
I'm sorry, it feels too close to a sports metaphor for you.
It is a sports metaphor, which is why I'm embarrassed that I'm blowing it. Bottom line is, you could always guarantee in the past that the Tories would not be getting the backing of any labor unions.
Yeah.
Well, those days are gone.
No, and the firefighters are interesting because, we've talked about this.
Can't tell the players without a program. That's the line I'm thinking of. Can't tell the players without a program. Come on, there we go.
So the firefighters, we mentioned the split between private and public sector unions, but of course the firefighters are a public sector union, but it's worth emphasizing that this is not coming out of the blue, right? The Ford government has made a bunch of changes that firefighters have appreciated, including new money for post-traumatic injury treatment, expanded treatment for cancer acquired while in the line of duty. Probably not a shock to people to say that firefighters they're around fires with lots of burning awful stuff, and they can acquire cancer because of what they just are around all the time. The Ford government has made these overtures to the movement, and the firefighters are responding in kind. I mean, I certainly was not shocked when we saw that endorsement come forward.
Can we call it a bromance? I think we can. There's definitely a gender split on these things.
Oh, yes, absolutely. And I mean, this is one of the criticisms of the Ford government is that, while they have, if we can put it this way, they've made a lot of overtures to more traditionally male-dominated professions in the union space, right? Construction, manufacturing.
Brotherhood of Electrical Workers.
Exactly, right. But when you talk about nurses, PSWs,
early childhood education workers,
right,
daycare
teachers,
workers.
Professions that are more dominated by women, the government has not been as solicitous.
Solicitous is a good word. Okay, up next, our quote of note. Let's return to our top story for our quote of note tonight. Here is Doug Ford, asked by the Globe and Mail's Laura Stone about how he feels about Donald Trump, whom he once quite admired.
Do you still consider yourself a Trump supporter?
Absolutely not.
Can you expand on that?
He's just so disappointing. I'm sure there's millions of Canadians that thought, okay, this might be a good change down in the U.S. It's been a disaster. I'd never support that guy in my entire life. What a, he goes up and just stabs you right in the heart. Forget that.
Okay, and now, as Paul Harvey used to say on the radio, and now you know the rest of the story, right? Like the Liberal ad was from behind the scenes, same event,
Yep.
right? Saying, I was 100% for Trump, loved him, big Republican. That's the rest of the story. Yep. Ford in front of the microphone saying, hell no, he put the shiv in me. I don't want anything to do with him anymore.
Yes, definitely no love lost.
Okay, shall we go to the mailbag?
Let's do.
Okay, if you've got a burning question, please send it along to this special email address, onpolitics@tvo.org. JMM, what do we got this week?
Here is a question from Marg Schweitzer from Murillo, Ontario. I don't believe I've ever been to Murillo, but it is just west of Thunder Bay. Marg Schweitzer writes, "Hi, Steve and John Michael. I can't stand politics, but love your show. Go figure. You must be doing something right. You make the most boring stuff come alive, and I've started recording your shows when I'm not around to listen. I don't do podcasts." Fair enough. Anyway, here's my question for you. Were there any Ontario premiers who served in either or both of the 20th century world wars? If so, and I assume they served before becoming premier, did their experience in the war affect how they governed or what they made a priority? Thank you for your answer. Marg.
Marg, I love this question because, of course, it allows us to look back at history, which John Michael and I are both big fans of. The answer is yes, there are certainly 4 premiers I know of that served in the 2 world wars of the 20th century. And yes, of course, it was before they became Premier of Ontario. Let's start with the most recent, and we'll go backwards. John Robarts, who was premier from 1961 to 71, he was in the Navy during World War II. You asked whether his wartime service affected his priorities as premier. The answer is, you bet. Here's the story I remember being told. John Robarts was on a ship. He was on a bunk bed. The other guy on the bunk bed was a unilingual francophone soldier. He was on the bunk bed as a unilingual anglophone. It's more than just a metaphor, but, we're all in the same bed now, right? We're all in the same ship now. That experience of trying to relate to and communicate with a French-speaking Canadian, I think, was part of the mix that allowed John Robarts in 1967, midway through his premiership, to create the Confederation of Tomorrow Conference, which was essentially the first ministers get-together since Charlottetown 100 years earlier. When they created the country, this one was designed to take a look at what was happening in the country in its centennial year. Mr. Robarts was very interested to know why bombs were blowing up in mailboxes in the province of Quebec, and, did his wartime service help contribute to his greater desire to understand Quebec? You bet. I think it sure did. But let's keep going. Leslie Frost, who was premier from 1949 to 61, he was wounded in World War I in 1918. He was a captain. George Drew was premier from 1943 to 48. He also served in World War I, an officer in the Canadian Field Artillery. People, even when he was the federal Tory leader and when he was premier of Ontario, called him Colonel Drew. He was always known as Colonel Drew. And let's do one more here. Mitch Hepburn was the premier of Ontario from 1934 to 42. He had already volunteered for World War I before the war began. He eventually served in the Canadian militia. He was transferred to the Royal Air Force. He actually got into a car accident and then got sick, so he was bedridden for much of the war, didn't serve in active duty, but he had volunteered and wanted to be there. So that's the list. Just, some may be wondering, what about Bill Davis? Bill Davis was born in 1929, so when the war began, he was 10 years old, so too young to have participated. So John Robarts was the last premier of Ontario to see action in one of the great wars of the 20th century.
And I have to ask, did you have to look any of that up, or is that just stored away in your mind?
Modesty compels me to say, let me put it this way. I think I knew it, but I fact-checked it anyway, just to make sure it was
best
true.
Practice.
Yeah,
yes.
best practice.
While we're talking about Northern Ontario, I did get a message from someone who, they asked that I not identify them, and given the context, that's fine. But we were talking about boundary adjustments last week.
Oh, yes. Right.
And how in Northern Ontario, we have not adjusted the seats the way we have in Southern Ontario. The belief from multiple governments now has been that we want to maintain the representation of Northern Ontario. And yet, Northern Ontario's population is smaller than it once was, and it's particularly smaller as a proportion of Ontario's overall population. And this person was happy to provide some numbers. The population of Northern Ontario peaked overall in 1996 at just above 800,000 people. The last census, that was down to 789,000 inhabitants in what we census defined as Northern Ontario. As a percentage of Ontario's population overall, Northern Ontario peaked as the share of 12.8% in the 1941 census.
1941?
Yes, and
That's a long time
relative to the rest of Ontario's population, Northern Ontario has been shrinking ever since. A very long decline. It was, as I say, 12.8% in 1941. It is now 5.5% of the Ontario population as of the 2021 census. So, we were talking about how the reason we do reapportionment of seats is because different parts of the province grow at different rates, and this is, I think, one illustration of that. As we preserve the number of seats and, in fact, grow the number of seats in Ontario, in Northern Ontario provincially, the population there is not keeping pace. And I don't think it's the biggest deal in the world. I'm not banging the drum to disenfranchise Northern Ontario, but I think just mathematically, it is the case that there are certainly parts of Northern Ontario that are overrepresented relative to the number of people that are in that part of the province.
I have a couple of follow-up questions.
Okay.
Is the Northern Ontario you are referring to there, does that include Muskoka?
I do not believe it does. No.
Because we talked about this last week,
Yes,
right?
indeed.
Remember the attempts, I think it was Ernie Eves 40 years ago, who tried to, I guess 45 years ago maybe, who tried to, and successfully managed to get Queen's Park to consider Muskoka and Parry Sound part of Northern Ontario in order to be eligible for northern grants and that kind of thing. Okay, so that's not including that. I have to say, and I'll go on record here as saying this, I know there is a principle that every riding in whatever jurisdiction you're talking about should have the same number of people so that everybody's votes count the same.
Yes.
However, there is also a tradition in this province that Northern Ontario, as you've just pointed out, will never have, because of just the vast land spaces and not enough people up there, it will never have the same number of people per riding as the southern ridings south of the French River.
Yes.
And that doesn't trouble me. You know, the services in Northern Ontario are not as good as the services in Southern Ontario. You want to get to a hospital, you want to get to a doctor, you want to get to school, you're going to be going a lot further to do any of those things.
Absolutely.
And if Northern Ontario is disproportionately represented at Queen's Park because it has more seats than its population would justify, I have to say I'm okay with that.
So am I. And, to be blunt about this, the seats in Northern Ontario, even with the current disproportion, if I could put it that way, just mathematically speaking, Northern Ontario is not going to decide this election. It is more competitive than it has been in the past, right? We talked about the Tories winning a seat in Timmins and elsewhere. The Tories are doing well in Northern Ontario. That will be interesting to watch. But it's sort of like, the way PEI has 4 seats. It's okay, great. You've got 4 seats. Toronto has 25, right? This is not where the competition will be won or lost.
And we're more than 6 times bigger than Prince Edward Island. And yet these are some of the things that go along with it. I remember talking to MPPs from up north. If you represent Davenport, as Marit Stiles does,
yes,
you can drive across your riding in 10 minutes.
Yes.
Maybe less. If you're in Northern Ontario, there are some places you cannot drive to. There are some communities you cannot drive to. You've got to fly in to some of the communities that you serve. It's extremely different up there, and so I don't mind the seat count reflecting that.
And we mentioned Gilles Bisson earlier in the podcast, and Gilles Bisson, for his career as an MPP, was always racking up enormous travel expenses, but that was because his riding was so large. He had to fly into some communities, and to save the taxpayers at least some money, he learned how to fly a plane and was literally flying himself around parts of Northern Ontario. So totally different context from what you find in Southern Ontario. Again, if you'd like to ask about any content on the show, you can always email us at onpolitics@tvo.org.
And that is the On Poly podcast for this Tuesday, February 4th, 2025.
You can follow our shows on Apple Podcasts so that you get notified each time a new episode is available. And you can see the video version of the podcast on the TVO Today YouTube channel.
And we want to remind everybody, we're, of course, back Friday night for our regular scheduled podcast, and then we're in here again next Tuesday, twice a week during the writ period. So until Friday, everybody, bye-bye.
Bye-bye, everyone.
When former Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland resigned due to her opposition to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's fiscal policy, it sent shockwaves through Parliament Hill. Now she wants her boss's job. But who was Chrystia Freeland before her meteoric rise in Canadian politics? Catherine Tsilikas is the author of a new biography. It's called Chrystia, From Peace Valley to Parliament Hill, and she joins us now for more. It's great to meet you and have you here.
Thank you so much for having me, Steve.
You can write about anybody. Why Chrystia Freeland?
I think there's 2 main answers to this. The first is that there's just not that many women here in Canada who reach the heights that she does in politics. I was on maternity leave in 2020. In the summer, it was the pandemic. Chrystia Freeland was appointed our first ever female finance minister. I could barely get myself out the door. I considered it a win if I could take my baby to the park. And there she was, mother of three, not only finance minister, but the deputy prime minister, number 2 to Justin Trudeau. So I wanted to know how she did it. The second reason is that we also don't have many stories about Canadian women in public life.
True.
When I first started thinking about doing this, I tried to find examples in the literature of things that I could kind of emulate and that to inspire me, and I could not find a biography of a female Canadian politician written by a female Canadian journalist.
Right.
I just couldn't. So I thought, in a way, this could be how I could contribute to that canon.
Is this an authorized or unauthorized biography?
This is unauthorized, which I've been saying makes it sound a lot more salacious than it actually is. All it means, of course, is that the subject had no editorial input or control over the book. I didn't speak with her. I did ask at the beginning.
I went to your book launch. Yeah. You tried very hard to get her to participate, and for whatever reason, they didn't see fit to give you an interview at the end of the day. Are you disappointed by that?
In the end, I think it probably worked out for the best. She knows a lot of journalists. So in the course of interviewing people for this book, I spoke with a lot of journalists, and they said, the second you speak with her, it becomes a bit of a different book. So you want to be able to keep a bit of arm's length distance, a little bit of objectivity, and I think that was good. I was able to speak with her sister, a couple of her aunts, her best friends. So I feel like I got close, but this way I was able to kind of paint a portrait the way other people see her, and I was happy with how that went.
As the title suggests, her life started in Peace River, Alberta in 1968. What was her childhood like?
She describes it as magical. So she was born, she was raised on a farm in Peace River. Her earliest memory was, driving with her dad on a combine, and she rode horses. It was quite wonderful. I think that instilled in her a real love of Canada. Being up there, I got to visit there. It is just stunning, gorgeous, expansive. So I think that that identity is really rooted deep in her. But her parents divorced when she was 8, so she moved with her mother and her sister to Edmonton, and there she was raised in this Ukrainian émigré community. So her maternal grandparents had come over after the Second World War, settled in Edmonton, and there she was thrown into these conversations about geopolitics. The future of the Soviet Union, would Ukraine ever gain its independence? And so I think that kind of gave her this one eye on the outside world.
I'm going to pick up on that again in a second, but I want to go back to something that I learned about in your book, didn't know beforehand. She was born Christina Alexandra Freeland, but as a teenager, she decided to change her name to Chrystia. How come?
Yeah, that's right. So her primary school, her elementary school teachers know her as Christine. It was as an homage to her Ukrainian heritage. She visited for the first time when she was 12 with her mom, her aunt, and her sister. And this was still when Ukraine was behind the Iron Curtain, so it was quite an experience, like realizing, what it means to live in an authoritarian regime. But so she came back, and she felt like she didn't want to gloss over, I think, that identity. It was very much a part of her. Her aunt was also named Chrystia and went through the same thing, and she talked it over with her aunt, who told her, in Canada, they tried to assimilate me. They tried to see me, they don't try not to make me as other, but I am other, and so that's why I wanted to embrace that, and that's what Chrystia felt as well. So she changed it.
The whole grandfather thing has been a bit of a controversy since she got into public life. Do you want to first of all say what it is and then tell us how she handled it?
So her maternal grandfather during the Second World War fled he was in Western Ukraine, but as the Red Army, the Russians were approaching, he decided to take his chances with the Germans, with the Nazis, because he saw them as friendlier to the goal of independent Ukraine, which is what he always wanted. So he went to Poland, to Krakow, and he worked for a paper there that was owned by the Nazi government and controlled by them. So it was very anti-Semitic, filled with hate-filled propaganda, but it was also pro-Ukrainian, so it kind of fit his intellectual leanings. And it meant that he was insulated from a lot of the harsh totalitarian rule that others in the city, the country, and across Europe were faced with. So that came out, the fact that her grandfather worked for this newspaper, while Chrystia Freeland was foreign minister. And I think way in which she addressed it. She didn't come out and say, it was a nuanced time. We have to kind of look at it through the lens of the time.
She said it was Soviet attempts to disinform. Disinform.
Exactly. So that puzzled me. That was, I think, one of the only things in this, going through her life. She's a journalist. She knows her history. She knows how important it is to tell the truth, evidence, facts. She loves those things. But yeah, so I'm not sure. I think she felt it was personal, perhaps. And her colleague told me there's an information hoardiness about her sometimes. But yeah, it was interesting. I think a lot of her generation would have similar grandparents who went through similar nuanced things. But yeah, I guess that's how she chose to address it.
Her mother ran for the NDP in the 1988 election.
Yeah.
How much of a seed do we think that planted?
You know what? I think she grew up surrounded by politics. Her parents were lawyers, and her dad was, of course, a lawyer and a farmer at the same time. But I don't think it was inevitable that she would have ended up in politics. She, as I have in there, at the age of 3, expressed an interest in becoming a lawyer. And when she got to Harvard, she still wasn't sure what she wanted to do. Maybe academic, maybe a lawyer. She ultimately went into journalism for 2 decades. So I think she thought that was a way that she could, be at the center of things and do something exciting. But I think she saw the change that her mother was able to bring through her activism. So her mother was a trailblazing feminist lawyer. She later helped Ukraine build its a new constitution and a legal system for Ukraine when it finally got its independence. And she saw how her mother had the ability to affect people's lives. And I think that's what she wanted to do when she did enter politics.
And her mother died young.
That's right. She was only 60. This was 2007.
So Chrystia was?
She was in her almost 1968, so
do the math. Yeah.
Okay. But yeah, she was in her 40s, and she was living in New York City. Her mom had given up her career to come and move in with the family so that Chrystia could flourish in hers, which I think allowed her to rise in the way that she did.
There's a very interesting line attributed to her in which she's asked, what do you think was sort of one of your biggest regrets? And she said, I wish I had been a more serious student. Which is an odd thing for somebody who went to Harvard and Oxford to say.
How much more serious can you get?
Well, exactly. So what's that all about?
So I asked friends about this because I was puzzled by that as well. By all accounts, she was a stellar student and made the most of her time at Harvard and Oxford. I think so. At Harvard, she spent a year. Her 3rd academic year was spent on exchange in Kyiv, in Ukraine, behind the Iron Curtain. And that kind of hooked her into that story of Ukraine and its future and where it was going. And so she ended up returning there. She pushed her schooling by a semester. She graduated a semester out of turn. I think what one friend told me was that she didn't graduate summa cum laude, like she didn't excel at the top academically. She did well, but I think maybe she was imagining what it would be like to have more time to just sit there and read and think. Chrystia was doing things. She was out there. She was starting her reporting career. So that's my best guess, is that she feels like, and her sister told me, she worked hard in other ways. She made connections at Harvard, right? She met one of her professors, Larry Summers, who would go on to become the chief economist at the World Bank, future U.S. Treasury Secretary. A close friend and mentor to this day. So she definitely worked hard, just perhaps in a different, not as bookish ways, perhaps.
Let's talk about her time in journalism, because she had several high-profile positions at the Financial Times, the Globe and Mail, Thomson Reuters. You spoke to many journalists who knew her and worked with her back in the day. What's the verdict on her time in journalism?
She was tenacious. More than a couple of people described her as ruthless, which surprised me. The way she worked to get her story, she was prepared. She was charming. She would lean on, early in her days in Ukraine and Russia, she would lean on this identity as, I'm just a farmer's girl, nothing to see here, and people would open up to her. These very powerful men in Russia, the oligarchs, kind of not realizing that this petite woman was committing to memory everything they were saying, and that the next day it would be on the front page of the Financial Times.
You say petite, so, and for people who have not seen her in person,
right? She's 5'2".
You think she's 5'2"?
I've been told she's 5'2". Her mother was like under 5 feet, I think. So.
I was going to say, I've met her, I've stood beside her.
Yes.
I don't think there's a chance she's 5'2".
So I don't know. Maybe in heels, right?
Yeah, maybe in heels.
Which she wears rarely. But that's it. She was like a dog with a bone. And I think that, the lessons that she takes from those days is, as an editor, there was 101 decisions that needed to be made, and if she didn't make them, the paper would not go to bed at night. So she drew on those lessons in the pandemic, in other crises in government. Just make the decision, because sometimes not making it is worse. That's one of the lessons I know that she took from those crazy years.
When she wrote that, what turned out to be a very famous book, Plutocrats, and we had her on this program talking about that, there was a 2012 book launch for her, at which she ran into a guy named Justin Trudeau.
Right.
And they had a conversation. First of a few, I gather. How did it go? What happened?
So that initial conversation, went well, but she didn't really think she'd see him again. But unbeknownst to her, at the party was also Katie Telford, who would obviously become Justin Trudeau's campaign manager and then chief of staff. And Katie had a chat with Chrystia's dad, who told her, hey, I think my daughter should run for you guys. And at the time, of course, Liberals were in third place, looking for anyone with credibility, star power to bring into the party. So Katie mentioned this to Justin Trudeau in the car on their way home, or on the way to a different event. And Trudeau looked at her and said, that's a great idea. You should make that a project for us. And so they did. They kept in touch with her. It took, for months it was a no, or maybe in the future. But then in 2013, Bob Rae stepped down as an MP in Toronto Centre, and all of a sudden there was a vacancy. And so it became a bit more real. And it was still a no more than a yes for a few weeks. But he did. Trudeau convinced her. I think he really believed in the fact that she could do it as a mother, he was not concerned with that part of it, and she believed in his values, and so he got her on board, and it was off to the races.
As he said on the way out, we had a pretty good close partnership for a long time. More to come on that. Let's do an excerpt from the book. Sheldon, you want to bring this up, and I'll read along for those listening on podcast. In politics, she has successfully employed the traits that served her so well in journalism. A seemingly endless supply of energy, a quirky charm, a capacity for coalition building, her dogged determination, a propensity for loyalty. Friends and colleagues describe her as principled but pragmatic, willing to consult widely and hear out the other side before landing on a decision. As a politician, she subscribes to the theory of positive intent, assuming, until proven otherwise, that the actions of her counterparts stem from a place of goodwill. Okay, let's unpack some of this here. Since Mark Carney announced his bid for the Liberal leadership as well, he has captured the lion's share of MP and cabinet minister endorsements. And I wonder how you think she is reacting to the fact that all of those allies who were supposedly so loyal are not with her right now.
Yeah. It's funny, as I saw cabinet minister after cabinet minister endorse Mark Carney, and not the woman with whom they've worked so closely over the past few years, I thought, on a personal level, that's got to sting, right, if it were me. But she's not easily offended. She puts her head down. There's a story, it's not in the book, but one of her best friends from Harvard told me, when they first met, the friend really loved her. And she thought, hey, this friendship can go somewhere. But Chrystia wore this patchouli scent, and it was just so this patchouli scent, right? This was the 80s, her basically like a perfume, right? It was kind of like potpourri-ish. And the friend was like, I just can't deal with this. I have to tell her. And she was so scared because she really liked her. But she told Chrystia, listen, you have to do something about this scent. And Chrystia was like, oh, you don't like it? No problem. I won't wear it anymore. And so the friend tells me this because, they're still friends to this day. And she says she's not easily offended. She doesn't hold people's decisions against them. And that's how she is able to build these coalitions and reach across aisles and make friends on the other side. I don't think she'll be paying much attention to that, honestly. I know she doesn't, she doesn't read about herself. She doesn't Google herself. I think she's incredibly focused. To her, it's not over until it's over. And she's used to being underestimated, right?
Okay, but this is a unique situation. She is running against Mark Carney. Yeah. He is godfather to one of her kids. These leadership races invariably are elbows up, very bruising affairs. They are tough on relationships. Never mind deep family friendships, as this is. How does that relationship survive this competition? And
so you read the part about her subscribing to this theory of positive intent, right? Mm-hmm. She assumes the other side has goodwill. I will be curious to see how it plays out. So far, there has not been any, personal jazz, mudslinging. Right. She did kind of try and call him out or try and get him to commit to running in the next election. But I wonder if... I'm not sure. Maybe she could do it. Maybe they can keep it cleaner than we're expecting. They certainly won't be able to do that with Pierre Poilievre. Whoever wins and goes to the general election, that will be, I feel like, a much dirtier affair. But I think she's able to compartmentalize. I don't want to put, words or sentiments into her, but she's very practical, and she has kept friends through, former bosses who who maybe, the situation wasn't great, but is still friends with. She's been through these very stressful NAFTA negotiations under the first Trump presidency, where I spoke with both the negotiators on the U.S. side and the Mexican side, all of whom had glowing things to say. You go through this crazy negotiation, and somehow they call her a friend. They go to her house and they eat together.
She cooked for them.
So yeah, of course, right? She also.
No.
Yeah. So I wonder if maybe there's a way to do it kind of higher. I don't know. I know the climate is so charged right now. And
well, how about did you see the interview on CBC News Network on the weekend that Rosie Barton did with her?
Yes. Yeah. I mean,
that was, well, okay, let me follow up on that, because that was as tough an interview as I've ever seen.
Yeah.
Never mind Rosie do with her, maybe with anyone.
That's right.
It was really hard. But here's the point. It's a change election.
Absolutely.
And how does Chrystia Freeland convince Liberals that she represents change, given that she has been, as Justin Trudeau said at his farewell press conference, the closest person he worked with for the last 10 years?
I don't know if you can do it. I don't know. And I know Mark Carney isn't, maybe the outsider that he might want to portray himself as, but he is different. He was not a cabinet minister. She was his right-hand woman from the very beginning. He put her in these successive cabinet positions where she delivered for him.
She had all the big jobs.
So many people told me that Justin Trudeau's policies were really Chrystia Freeland's policies. Like former Prime Minister Brian Mulroney, who I spoke with before he passed, said the signature achievement of this government will be coming out of NAFTA with an okay deal, and she was the point person on that. Childcare is a major policy. That was her. It wasn't coming from Trudeau. It was her who pushed that, the idea for that, and she pushed it through. I don't know that you can. I know she's trying, disavowing the carbon tax, the capital gains tax. I'm not sure. And I think when I see the cabinet, her colleagues endorsing Carney, I wonder if it's not personal. I wonder, maybe they truly believe that he is the best chance at change. The Trudeau brand is so toxic right now, and she is just so tied up in
Mind
that.
you, her position on this has been, she was on Morning Joe, and she was asked about the carbon tax, and how can you change your mind on the carbon tax? She said, well, I listen to the people. People don't want it, so we're changing our mind.
Yeah.
Can that work?
I think she believes it can. Friends have told me she is incredibly pragmatic. And so if she feels like that's the way the wind is blowing, she will U-turn. And that's fine. And I think that's fine. And I think she's okay with that. Will people see it look at it as a game? I'm not sure if it'll change people's mind. But it's right in that Pierre Poilievre said we're going to be in this carbon tax election next time. And look, what Donald Trump is doing has maybe shifted the priorities.
It's not going to be a carbon tax election.
I think so, right?
No, not looking that way now.
Our sovereignty now. What?
Yeah.
So I think her battle is overcoming that connection that she has with the Prime Minister. I don't know how you separate that record. Yeah.
Catherine, do you know if she's read the book?
I don't know either way. Like I said, she does not look herself up. She doesn't Google herself. So I feel like she has a bit going on right now. So I would be surprised if she had. Maybe in the future. But as far as I know, I actually don't know either. We'll see.
I presume at some point you would love to sit down over a cup of coffee with her and just sort of have a chance to meet her.
You know what? It would be so surreal because I never actually, for the book, sat down with her. I didn't talk with her. I actually have never met her. I interviewed her once over the phone in 2015 for when she was running then. I think it would be quite surreal to see someone whose life I have delved into and thought about for so many years.
I mean, think about it. You know her life better than probably anybody in the world except her.
It's
right.
It's bizarre.
I mean,
I think so because and
you've talked to dozens of people who know her.
So that's why I spoke with I think it was around 130 people, and I needed to do that to feel like I had any sort of authority because everything in there, my voice isn't really in this book. Everything in there is attributed to someone in one way or another, and that's how I felt we could best. I wanted to portray her life for those who are interested, and leave the opining up to the reader. You can kind of make your own decision based off the stories in there.
Yeah. Let me ask you one last thing, and that is that she's had a very impressive career so far. And, you and I have both talked to lots of people who think she could do the job were she given the opportunity to do it. I have also talked to lots of people, and I'm sure you saw her campaign kickoff, which did not go well. And many people have observed that despite having been, in the arena for the last 10 years, her communication skills and her ability to kind of convey whatever you're supposed to be able to convey in that job have not improved all that much over 10 years. How does that make sense?
Okay, so I mentioned the way she addressed the grandfather story was puzzling to me. Something else that was puzzling to me is this communication style. So many people I spoke with from her early journalism years through the government years speak of her ability to connect with people and modulate herself to whoever she's speaking with, whether that's, the person on the doorstep talking about immigration.
But that's one-on-one.
That's right, exactly.
Not through a TV lens.
Perhaps that's it. Perhaps it's an inability to project. I think she has a real problem with the way she comes off to the average voter. I have heard her detractors say she comes off as almost condescending, holier than thou.
Schoolmarmish is the word. It's a sexist expression, but that's what they say.
Yeah, out of touch. I'm thinking there was that when she made the comment, everyone needs to tighten their belts a couple of years ago. My family's canceling our Disney Plus subscription. That was meant in an earnest way. She is really frugal. When she first became a cabinet minister, she asked if she could have a futon in her office to save money. She really believes this, but it wasn't taken that way. And so she the inability to see that it might not be taken in the way that she meant it. I don't know. My only guess is that she just doesn't want to. I know she doesn't pay lip service to things like image, things like her clothes and what she wears. I feel like this is maybe kind of tangential to that. She feels like she has more important things to do, and that is an area where she hasn't put any work into. Perhaps I do notice. I feel like she got a new social media person because there are some really sassy videos on Instagram. But will that be enough? And I think being a politician, she doesn't have that natural charisma that Trudeau does, Obama. But then again, I spoke with a lot of people who know her and Carney, and a lot of them told me they couldn't see Carney in politics because he's technocrat, gets easily frustrated with people who he feels are irrational, and they saw her as better able to do the retail politician side of things. I don't know.
Well,
I guess we'll see. Right?
March the 9th, we'll know for sure.
Right, exactly. TBD.
Well, regardless, I hope you get that cup of coffee with her someday. I'm sure you would really appreciate that.
A glass of wine. I feel like that's more.
Maybe some wine. Okay. The book is called Chrystia, From Peace River to Parliament Hill, and we are delighted that it has brought Catherine Silikis into our studio. Thanks, Catherine.
Thank you, Steve.
And that is the agenda for Tuesday, February 4th, 2025. Tomorrow, Marit Stiles makes her case for why the NDP should form the next Ontario government. Hope you'll be with us for that. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and we'll see you again tomorrow.
We are where you are. TVO's current affairs journalism is available across platforms across Ontario, on Roku, Amazon Fire, Apple TV, and more. Catch The Agenda, The Thread, onpoli, and other podcasts, docs, and video series on the device of your choice when you choose.